So we wanted to say, first of all, thank you so much for choosing to spend an hour with us. I'm willing to bet that most of you crossed your mind that an hour could be spent riding your bicycle, mowing your lawn, going to the grocery store, but instead, or sitting on your backyard, you chose to come and spend an hour here to participate in this conversation and be part of our democracy. So we're here to tell you that you made the right choice. An hour spent participating in our democracy is our best spent. So thanks so much for making that choice. I'd also like to let you know that this town hall with Seth Moulton is co-hosted by Indivisible, by 6 chapters in the 6th district. So your hosts here today are Indivisible Freedom North Shore, Greater Andover Indivisible, I Rise Newburyport, Minuteman Indivisible in Lexington, North Reading Indivisible, and North Shore Indivisible in Beverly. So we are part of a nationwide movement of grassroots progressive activists. We started just after the 2016 election. Our 6 groups are part of 100 chapters across the state and close to 6,000 chapters across the US. We're all about, Indivisible is all about creating ways for people to step up and take active part in our democracy at the local, state, and federal levels. So together to voice our support of policies, candidates, and elected officials that show what an inclusive democracy can look like. We are about showing what democracy can look like, that democracy is us. That democracy is us here today, stepping up to have an open conversation with our representative from Washington, who represents us there. So that's why we're so pleased to have you here today, and so pleased to have Representative Seth Moulton here to be part of this conversation with us. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, April. All right, is this working now? You can hear me, okay, good. Thank you so much, April. Thank you for welcoming me, and thank you all for coming. Attendance is always lower when it's a beautiful day outside, and it is a beautiful day outside. This hasn't been exactly a spring for the record books, but this is a summer day in New England, and so it means a lot that you're in here. And it is really important that you're here because we need people to participate in our democracy right now. I think it's great that we're doing this in Peabody because just after the 2016 election, how many people were feeling depressed? I certainly was. And it was one of those times when I thought, I wish there was someone's shoulder to cry on. I wanted to call President Obama and say, what do we do? But I wrote an email late that night, about 2:30 in the morning, to my team, and I said, this is the time that we need to step up and lead. This is the time that America needs us more than ever before since we've had this job. And there will be a lot of people who are looking to us for guidance about what to do. And so one of the things we did in those very early days is we got together several of the organizations in the area that we thought would be particularly hurt by a Trump administration. Climate change organizations, women's rights organizations, refugee organizations. And we asked them to come to Peabody High School so that they could meet with potential volunteers. And we invited the community, and in the space of, we had about 3 days notice, and 800 people showed up to Peabody High School saying, I want to do something. Not just I'm depressed, not just I'm upset, not just I didn't like this guy, but I want to do something to make this better. And we had a discussion, we talked about different things, but then they just spread out and met with these different organizations and found ways that they could get involved and volunteer. And that's so important. And it's what everybody in the different organizations, I'm not going to try to rattle them all off, but especially the individual visible groups, have done over the past 2 years, is you've stood up and you said, it's not enough just to disagree, I'm going to get involved. I'm going to make a difference. So thank you for that leadership. It certainly makes my job just a tiny bit easier. And there's a lot to talk about, as my daughter knows. My daughter, Emmy, is here. And of course, my amazing wife, Liz. Liz, can you just stand up and say hi to everybody real quick? That got her attention. So Emmy just turned 8 months, and Liz and I are two working parents who are just figuring out the first child thing and making it all work. Emmy has more Acela points than most people in the room already, I think, given how often Liz has to go to New York, and we always try to figure out ways to meet there and all that. But Emmy's a big part of what we're talking about for me, because this is her future. And I don't want her growing up in a world defined by Donald Trump. And there's so much work we have to do on so many different issues. Let me start with voting rights. We have a simple principle in a democracy, which is that every vote counts. And yet, in the world's greatest democracy, that's not the case today. Because of gerrymandering, which, a little responsibility here, folks, it started in this district. Because of gerrymandering, because of voter suppression, because of the Electoral College. These are all things that mean that not everybody's vote does count. So that Hillary Clinton got 3 million more votes in the last election, but she's not president of the United States. So that because of gerrymandering, a lot of people feel that no matter who I vote for, I'm not going to have a say in this election, and we tend to pick representatives from the extremes. Because of voter suppression that still happens today, especially against people of color in the South. You read the history books and you think, okay, we solved that problem back in the 1950s and the 1960s, and yet we haven't. Because if we had, I think Stacey Abrams would be the governor of Georgia. And Dan McCready, who's one of those great House candidates, would be the representative from North Carolina. Votes were literally stolen. He's still running, and he's still running. So we have a lot of work to do. I've proposed a new Voting Rights Act that will, first of all, go back and say, for those problem counties where we've had historic problems with voter suppression, that's still going to be evaluated by the federal government as it was under the original Voting Rights Act. But more than that, we need to end gerrymandering. We need to start a movement to end the Electoral College. And we need to make sure that rehabilitated felons are able to vote. These are all different strategies that have been used to suppress the vote from communities that politicians didn't think would get their vote. So we have a lot of work to do on that. Let me talk about immigration really quick. I spent some time down at the border during the last campaign, and we met with everybody. And unlike most congressional delegations, which go down for 5 hours and do a press conference and go home, I spent 2 days down there on both sides of the border. I think I was the only member of Congress to spend time in Mexico and not just in the United States. And we met with legal immigrants and illegal immigrants. We met with ICE officials and ACLU lawyers. We met with Customs and Border officials. We met the heads of refugee organizations in Juarez. We spent an afternoon with a house full of deported veterans, a term that shouldn't even exist. Not a single person said, the system is fine, we just need to enforce the existing laws. No one said that. Everybody on all different sides of the issue said the system is broken and we need fundamental reform. We need to have a pathway to citizenship, not just for dreamers, but for everybody who is a part of our community and here working in the United States. I brought a TPS holder. Does everyone know what temporary protected status is? TPS. We've been issuing it to different countries where people are under threat. And at one point we issued it to El Salvador because of all the violence in El Salvador. And there's a great El Salvadoran community here, especially in Lynn. And I brought a member of that community, really a leader in that community, to the State of the Union a couple years ago. He is a supervisor at the Kettle Cuisine plant in Lynn. The CEO of that plant said, I can't replace this guy. If he gets deported, I have a massive business problem at our factory. He has a great family. He's a leader in the community. He's here paying taxes and contributing to our society. And yet the Trump administration wants to kick him out. Go back to a country that he left not to come and take some American job, but because he had to flee for his life. So we need a pathway to citizenship. We also need a pathway to citizenship for the students who come and study here. We have a lot of them here in Massachusetts, especially from China. There are 800 Chinese students at Harvard right now, getting the top education in the, I shouldn't say it because I went to Harvard, but in a very good education. And what are we going to do? Well, when they're done, we're going to say, go home. Get out of here. We don't want you contributing to our economy, our scientific research. Just go do it for China. And that's so backwards. It doesn't make any sense. So we have a lot of work to do on immigration, and it's going to take fundamental reform. Let me talk about the climate for a second. We are in a crisis. That's why I was one of the first members of Congress to sign on to the Green New Deal when it was an open framework. Emmy likes that as well. She's like, that's my planet too, folks. Now, I've been talking about what the components of the Green New Deal should be. And I think there's three very broad categories. And since you're all a very educated, climate-conscious audience, let me just go through what I think should be the three main components. One, America needs to lead the way. That means leading the way in carbon-free energy generation. It means leading the way in taxing carbon so that there's economic benefit to reducing your carbon footprint. It means developing the next generation of carbon-free electricity technologies so that not only can we have them here at home, but we can sell them to the rest of the world. The Green New Deal should grow jobs, not grow our deficit. And that's one way to do it. The second thing is opponents of these issues, like some of the opponents of the Paris Accord, for example, will tell you, well, it's okay to do that in America, but not when the majority of carbon emissions are coming from the developing world. Because if we go into the Paris Accord, it's going to let China and India and places like that just totally eclipse us in terms of carbon emissions. And you know what? They're wrong about Paris, but they're not wrong about the fact that a lot of emissions are coming from the developing world. But this is, again, a place where America should lead. To address this, we need carbon-free generating technologies that are small and distributed and can work in rural communities where we don't necessarily have an electric grid. But we should be developing those technologies, not China. We should be selling them to the rest of the world. And that should be a priority of the Green New Deal. The third thing is more controversial with the climate community, which is carbon capture technology. And it's controversial because some people hear carbon capture and they say, well, that's just an excuse for keeping the pollution going. Because if you can take the carbon out of the atmosphere, then we don't need to stop putting it in. Well, that's not true. Okay, you can do both. But today, just this afternoon, there is too much carbon in the atmosphere already, so we need to start pulling it out. So those are the three big things we need to do. We need to make the developed world carbon-free. We need to make the developing world carbon-free. And we need to develop the technologies to actually start taking some of the carbon out of the atmosphere that's already there, because there's already too much. And that's why the planet is warming, not in 30 years, not in 50 years, but today. A couple other things. Women's reproductive rights are under assault across the country. And it's coming from all directions, but the most hideous example are these new anti-abortion laws coming out of state legislatures, some of which literally criminalize seeking an abortion even if you've been raped. I mean, that's how extreme these laws are. And this is happening because of one person, Brett Kavanaugh. That's why it's happening. At the end of the day, this is what this whole fight is all about, because they're just hoping that these laws will get appealed to the Supreme Court, and because Brett Kavanaugh is now on the Supreme Court, and God knows you can't trust what he says, he will just change his mind on Roe v. Wade, he will vote against it, and that historic precedent of almost 50 years will be overturned. And I would love to be able to just stand up here and tell you a whole bunch of good news and everything's going to be all right, but I can't on this. I think there's a real risk that that happens. And that's why it's so important that we fight this across the country. It's why I called out Vice President Biden on his position on the Hyde Amendment and said, with all due respect, sir, you got to change your position. It's why I stood out in front of the Supreme Court, and I think I was the only politician there who actually said we should impeach Brett Kavanaugh because he lied in his hearing. I'm sorry. I don't care whether you like the guy or not, you don't lie in a confirmation hearing and then get to sit on the nation's highest court. So we got a lot of work to do on this. A couple other things just really quickly, because they're local issues that I know people care about a lot here and I care a lot about. I authored a bill to save the right whales, and the right whales, there's only about 400 left. All right. The New England Aquarium came in to visit and gave me a right whale doll that I brought home for Emmy. It's not the cutest, animal, but there's only 400 left. 421, I think, at the last count. And this is our chance. This is our generation's chance to say, we're not going to let this iconic species go extinct on our watch. But it's a fight. It took a while to get this bill through committee. We did get it through committee. We're now, it's part of an appropriations bill, but it doesn't have enough money attached to it, so we're trying we're authoring an amendment on the floor when the appropriations bill comes up to raise the funding for it. So it's still a fight, but we're working on it and we're leading on it, and we're working very closely with institutions like the New England Aquarium to get this done. We're also, by the way, working with fishermen. And that's a really important thing, because we're not going out there and just saying, well, don't worry about the fishermen, we're just going to do this. No, we're trying to work in partnership with them. And that's something we've always tried to do in this office. The last thing is, for those of you from up by the Merrimack River, the combined sewage overflow situation, which is that because of climate change and because of the more dramatic swings in our climate and the rainfall, the excessive rainfall that we've had here. I don't ever remember Lynn flooding in my childhood, but Lynn has flooded like several times. And Peabody didn't flood, But that's happening a lot now in the Merrimack Valley. Because the sewage systems can't handle all this, a lot of sewage is getting dumped directly into the Merrimack River. And we're working with Congresswoman Lori Trahan on this, but my particular bill will notify communities, will require notifications of communities when that happens. That's not the case right now, so people don't even know when there's sewage flowing down the river. So those are a few of the things that we're working on that we need to all work together on. And with pretty good, right?
She agrees.
He agrees. But this doesn't happen in a vacuum. My job is to represent all of you, and I take that responsibility very seriously. It's why I held more town halls than any other Democrat in the entire Congress, House or Senate, in my first term, and I keep doing this because I can't do my job effectively if I don't hear from you. Now, we're not always going to agree, but you've got to be a part of the debate. And that's what this is all about. So thank you so much for coming here, for taking an hour out on a beautiful Saturday. And with that, I would love to turn it over to you and your questions.
I didn't think I'd be the first one to say anything. So I'm actually, my heart's kind of in my throat at the moment. So my name's Caddy. I'm from Billerica. Even though it doesn't look it, I am only 18 years old. I'm trying to build a local government career in the town of Billerica, which is a very, very conservative town.
Voted for Trump.
Very much so. Well, I think the number was 92%.
It wasn't that high, but
which is lunacy. It really is. For full disclosure, I actually was with the congressman about an hour and a half ago. Me and a couple other people sat down with him. We had the LGBT Cup of Coffee event, I think is what the event was called. We had very nice discussion there. We discussed transgender military service, abortion of massages, the Equality Act, transgender youth, mental health awareness. A lot of positivity was discussed. I say this because what I'm about to say might shift the tone a bit, and I want to say it's nothing personal right now. So right now in Massachusetts and all over the country, we are facing an opioid epidemic. And it's something that's actually near and dear to my heart because I had a family member who was addicted to opioids, who is thankfully clean, I think 6 years clean now. But it's evil. The drug companies are deliberately, at least in how I see it, are deliberately getting people addicted for profit. So the reason why I say this question might seem like it's changing tone is because according to what I have seen and what some people in town have seen, in my town have seen, is that you have taken donations from the opioid people.
What people?
I wish I had the info. Apologize.
Not to my knowledge, but if you'd be happy to learn.
The only reason I even said is because all donations have to be public, and if I'm not mistaken, we have a substance abuse prevention committee in my town, and the chair of that is really into opioid rights, and she had found that your presidential campaign had taken money from opioid manufacturers.
Not to my knowledge. I don't think that's the case. I've never been accused of this before. But look, my record on this is very clear. I mean, and frankly, even if I had, I can give you a very, very long list of all the bills that I've co-sponsored to address this crisis. And that's what matters. That's what matters. But I'll also say this. We wouldn't even be having this conversation if Congress had done enough on this crisis, because we haven't. And the biggest problem is that, much like with the Right Whales bill that I discussed, it's one thing to support the legislation and even to get it passed through Congress. But the way Congress works is you have authorizing bills and you have appropriations bills. The authorizing bills authorize programs and whatnot. The appropriations bills fund them. And what we've continually failed to do as a Congress, House and Senate together, is actually fund all the opioid treatment programs, aggressive action, et cetera, that we have authorized. And we've often authorized it in a bipartisan way. But for too many years, it's candidly many of the conservatives in Congress who have refused to fund these initiatives. And as a result, we have some really good ideas, and some of them come right here from this district. It was the Gloucester police chief who developed the ANGEL program. The ANGEL program where you can come in to the police office, to the police station, turn in yourself and your drug paraphernalia, and rather than get arrested, which is what the law said was supposed to happen, you get sent right to a treatment program. And it literally is a model for the nation. I brought the Gloucester police chief down to Washington. We brought him around to meet with colleagues, to explain this program, to show why it's been so effective. And other communities now all across this country have adopted it as well. An interesting fact about this program, it was started a few years ago in Gloucester, Massachusetts, and the very first patient, customer, or whatever you want to call it, was literally from California. Because it was the only one in the nation, and he was so desperate to get help, he came all the way from California to Cape Ann to turn himself in and say, I want to get help for this. And what your family member has done by going through addiction and actually being clean for 6 years is actually unusual. It's really hard to get to that point. These are terribly addictive drugs. And one of the other things that I have led on both in Massachusetts and in Congress writ large, is the legalization of cannabis. And this is an issue that's very close to my heart because I know a lot of veterans who use cannabis specifically so that they don't have to use opioids. Too many times I've heard the stories of veterans going to the VA and getting prescribed opioids for their pain. And so, because they can't even talk about that with their VA healthcare provider, I've co-sponsored 3 bipartisan, and it's hard to make these bipartisan, folks, bipartisan bills to change this. One that will make it legal for VA healthcare providers to talk to their patients about cannabis, because even if they can't prescribe it, you ought to be able to talk. I mean, literally I talk with fellow veterans about this on our Facebook group because they're going to each other for advice because they can't talk to their doctor. That's how messed up this is. 2, we have a bill to just simply survey the veterans population to understand how many are using this and what kinds of needs they have. And 3, we have an education effort because a lot of VA healthcare providers don't learn anything about it because it's still federally illegal. And my hope is that by pursuing these issues in a bipartisan way with veterans, it will really serve as a model for the rest of the country. It's also why I was one of the only federal or state politicians from Massachusetts to support the legalization of cannabis when it came before the Massachusetts voters. And almost everybody else in the delegation was opposed to this. Governor, Mayor Boston, Attorney General, other reps. But I said, no, this is something that we should do because, folks, whether you like it or not, people are smoking marijuana. Let's just regulate it and make it safe rather than by keep pretending that by keeping it illegal, it's not going to happen. I voted just the day before yesterday for a very controversial amendment on the floor of the House to deschedule some substances to make it easier to pursue legalization at the federal level. And I don't know if I was the only person from Massachusetts to vote for that, but I might have been because there were only about 50 of us out of 435 in the House who voted for this. And it's just another step in the right direction. I don't want to make it easier for your family member or anyone else to get access to dangerous drugs. It's also, by the way, why I am the author of a piece of legislation to punish the producers of Chinese fentanyl. China produces about 75% of the fentanyl on the streets of America. China has said that they will stop this. They have not. So I'm also the author of a bipartisan bill to address that. I wrote an op-ed about it recently. I don't want anyone to have easy access to these drugs, but I absolutely want to make sure they get treated if they have them and that they have alternatives. So I'm going to keep fighting for this. And I'm not going to just keep fighting for it and sort of voting with the crowd. I'm going to stay out in front of it and leading the way. So thanks, Caddy, for your question.
We got another question over here.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hey, sir, how are you?
Congressman. I'm Herb Harris. I live in Peabody.
Thanks for coming.
And thank you for being here. Thank you for your service, both as a Marine and your current service to the country.
Thank you.
And before I forget, happy first Father's Day.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
One issue that hasn't been brought up yet, and there's so many I would love to talk about, but is guns. There was another shooting last night at a Costco in California. So let me read the Second Amendment. Here's the Constitution. I felt like Mr. Khan, anyway, but okay. A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The important lines in that is a militia. That is the purpose of the Second Amendment. It has, when the amendment was passed, we did not have a standing army. We needed a militia to protect the country should something happen. After King George, our founding fathers were afraid we'd have a tyrannical president. Which we seem to have now, but that's another story. But it doesn't give the people the right to have guns to protect themselves at home or for their children to find their guns and maybe accidentally kill themselves or their friends, or some crazy person shooting up Sandy Hook kids, or a racist shooting up a black church, or an anti-Semite shooting up a temple, or just a crazy person, kids shooting up high school. It doesn't give anybody any right for that. When will Congress get off, excuse the expression, its collective ass, and do something about this and show some backbone? That's my question. When will they?
Well, thank you, sir, for the question. And you know, I'm actually, as you might imagine, I get gun questions all the time. This might be the first time that someone has just brought a copy of the Constitution and read it, and it's really instructive, so thank you for doing that. If you listen, just read that passage again, if you would, because I want to make a comment specifically on this.
Well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed.
Right.
So the emphasis is on the militia.
Right.
Doesn't say you can have guns just to say.
Right. So, what if I were to take that phrase and just shift it to another issue, like, say, the freedom to travel? And I were to say, a well-maintained highway being important for the free travel from Boston to New York, the right to have a horse and buggy on that highway shall not be infringed. Because when that was written, that was the only way you could get to New York, folks. Okay? It's actually fairly analogous here, right? Because we're saying when we needed a well-regulated militia, being important for a free country, which it was at the time, as you explained, the right to bear arms shall not be infringed. But I'm sorry, this is a different world right now. And we don't need a well-regulated militia to ensure a free country. But the way the Supreme Court has recently interpreted this is basically the first phrase and the second phrase don't matter. Let's just pretend they don't exist and just start the sentence with the right to bear arms shall not be infringed. And that's just wrong. Like, it's not, you don't need a degree, a PhD in English to understand what I'm talking about. Just like it's okay for us to say that we get the point that horses and buggies were important once upon a time, but that doesn't mean that we need to allow them on I-95 today. We don't. And we don't need assault weapons to hunt. We don't need assault weapons on our streets or in our schools. And you know what? We've actually realized this because there are plenty other weapons of war that we've outlawed. Right? We don't allow grenades anymore. I spent 3 years of my life in Iraq. For 3 years, almost over 1,000 days, I had 2 grenades strapped to my body every single day. And I never blew myself up. I was perfectly safe. I would feel totally confident with 2 grenades right here today. And I would feel confident that I wasn't a threat to all of you. Would you be happy if I had 2 grenades on me? No. And we've just decided as a society that that's a weapon of war that we don't need hanging out, regardless of how safe that person says he is or she is with grenades. So this isn't such a radical concept. It's not such a radical concept when we say that if you buy a gun, you should have a background check, just like you do when you go to a gun store. It's already done at gun stores, why shouldn't it be done at gun shows? It's not a radical concept to say that if you can't get on a plane because you're on a terrorist watch list, maybe you shouldn't buy a gun either. And none of these things infringe on the right to go hunting or anything else. So they're reasonable things. They're supported by the vast majority of Americans, Democrats, Independents, and Republicans. Everything I just mentioned. But we can't get it done in Congress because of the NRA. Because a lot of politicians, irrespective of whether they take money from the NRA, refuse to vote against it. I had the two most bipartisan gun bills in the last Congress. And that's important because we've tried doing this in a partisan way for years. It's never worked. Somehow we've got to figure out a way to get Republicans on board, because even if we did pass it, it would just be undone when the Republicans take back power unless we can do it in a bipartisan way. And one of those bills was to ban bump stocks. I worked really hard to get a lot of Republicans on board, and we did well. Literally more Republicans on board that bill than any other gun bill before Congress in modern memory. The NRA has banned bump stocks from their own headquarters. Think about that. Okay? They know that these things are a bad idea. But Congress won't vote for it. So there's a few things that we need to do to change that. One is we need to get more people from conservative organizations on board with this. And it's not just Republicans in Congress, it's like faith organizations, churches, synagogues, places that tend to have conservatives but also care about things like not shooting up kids in schools. That's something that we can all do in this community. Reach out to some of our conservative friends and say, this is consistent with your values to support this kind of legislation. The second thing we can do is we can continue to lead the way in Massachusetts. If you walk by my office, you'll see a bunch of slides that show detail some of the work that we're doing. One of those slides has all 50 states listed in order of how tough their gun laws are. Massachusetts is at the bottom, and I don't know if it's Alaska or something else is at the top. They're ranked by order of who has the toughest gun laws. And then they have a graph next to it that says how much gun violence do they have. And the graph goes exactly like this. Because it's very clear and proven that if you have tougher gun laws, you have less gun violence. Massachusetts is leading the way in this, and we should continue to do that because it does set an example for the country. And someday, just like marriage equality or health care, the rest of the country will follow our lead. The other thing you can do, the last thing I'll say, there's a lot we can do here, but the last thing I'll say is that we should be really proud of our kids who are leading the way on this issue. And the kids who are willing to come out and step up and speak out on this, it does make a difference. It really does make a difference. I remember a kid standing up at a town hall I held in Amesbury not too long ago and saying, you know, Seth, I just don't feel that anybody in Washington understands what it's like to go to high school today and literally be afraid that you're going to get shot when you show up to school. We need to hear that message more. So thank you for raising that, and thank you for inviting a constitutional discussion. Thanks.
Hi. I was very glad to hear you mention combined sewage overflows earlier.
Yes.
Because I live in Newburyport, and I've seen that sludge going down the river, and it's horrifying. And I realize this is not just the Merrimack, this is all over the country, and this is part of the climate crisis. And I think the notification is obviously an important first step, because I would not want to know I'd been in that river when that happened.
Hardly the only step, but a first step, yeah.
It's the first step, right. And I've been reading that our state senator, Diana DiZoglio, has been working with Lori Trahan on the next step, which is getting the federal government involved.
Yes, and we've been working very closely with Diana as well.
Okay, that's good, because this is obviously a Massachusetts and New Hampshire issue, and with other issues, with other states, it's probably, there's probably a lot of states that have this problem. So that's what I just wanted to ask you. I hadn't heard your name associated with that.
Oh, no. We were working on this long before Lori Trahan even showed up. So don't worry about that. No, we've been
not just on notification, but on the next steps.
Yes. No, we've been leading the effort on this, and we've kind of divided up the work. But yeah, long before Lori was elected, we've been at the forefront of this. Rick and Morgan actually both are. Morgan is my district representative from that part of the district, and Rick is my district director for the entire state, for the entire district. Do you have anything you'd like to add on this?
No, this is an issue that we hear every time we're up there. And I'll say, coming to work for the federal government, I thought the one thing I would never have to deal with is sewers, and here we are. So it's taking up a lot of our time because it's critically important to public safety, it's important to tourism and the economy, and we'll continue to fight on this issue.
Yeah, we've been
The other thing that I've done is I've also really started this conversation with the New Hampshire representatives, because it is, that's part of their, problem as well. There was actually some resistance from some of the communities in Lori's district on the notification piece, because they felt that it was sort of putting the blame on them, and the town of Newburyport will get notified that Lawrence has released sewage, and everyone gets blaming Lawrence, and that's part of the reason why we took the notification piece, because there was some blowback from some of these other towns. But I don't really care about the blowback. But we've really, I think, had a very good partnership on this, both within the federal delegation, but also with our state and local partners.
Well, I look forward to hearing your name associated with this, and I'll make sure everybody in Newburyport knows when I hear that.
Well, they certainly should. I mean, we work with the mayor, and we have for a long time. So if anyone is peddling false information, look, my job is not to go and brag about everything I do. It's to get the work done.
And we're filing the public disclosure bill next week, and so we'll do the press related press, so you see that in the newspaper.
All right, I appreciate that, because it is important. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for being here. I consider climate change to be the most important issue of our time. But what I'm really worried about is election integrity. Because we're not going to get things done until we start electing
That's right.
Democrats. I'm glad to hear you talk about gerrymandering, voter suppression, and there are a lot of aspects. The one that I didn't hear you talk about was big money. Big money in politics. So my question is, do you support a constitutional amendment? I know that's a long road. And what else can be done other than a constitutional amendment?
I do, and I've supported it for a long time. And I don't know how many of you, if you follow the issue, you must know Professor Larry Lessig at Harvard. I was very proud to be endorsed by him in my first campaign, because he's very selective with his endorsements. But as someone who is trying to lead the way on election reform and getting money out of politics, I think it's important to say this, though. It'd be very easy for me to just say, look, I agree with you, I support the constitutional amendment, and that's going to solve the problem. But the constitutional amendment we're talking about is to essentially overturn Citizens United, which allows unlimited corporate donations to campaigns. And believe it or not, ever since Citizens United went through the Supreme Court process, there actually haven't been a tremendous number of corporate donations directly to campaigns. And the reason is that corporations, from a business perspective, don't often like to take sides. Now, maybe a gun corporation or something like that would, but the point is that we have to know, as advocates for this issue, that simply doing that constitutional amendment is not going to solve the problem. And I think there's a little bit of a risk that if we put all our eggs in that one basket, maybe it gets through and then the Republicans say, okay, issue's done. And that's not the case. So there's not a silver bullet here. It's hard because of the constitutional freedoms around free speech and everything that we have that are important to our country. But we've got to figure out ways to do this. And I think we've got to explore options like public financing of elections, like potentially, one of the things they do in the UK is interesting, is the campaign season is just shorter. And so it just, the money game doesn't matter as much. But look, this is a real issue, and all of us, whether you're running for Congress or president, spend a lot of time just trying to get people to donate. The DNC has made that a requirement for being in the debates. That's why I'm not in the first debate. I mean, mainly because I just got in recently, but it's just donations. You have to literally spend money to get people to donate to you, right? And it's not really how we should be choosing our nominee or our elected officials or anything else. We should be having a forum of ideas. So I'm with you on the constitutional amendment. I will continue to support it, but we also need to continue working more broadly to figure out other things that we can do. I'll tell you one last story about this. when I was a freshman in Congress, a colleague came and proposed a piece of election finance reform legislation. And I read it, and it was an interesting proposal, and I think on the surface it sounded good, but having just gone through a really tough race to get elected myself, I said, you know, the problem with this is that it's a good idea in theory, but it's really just going to help incumbents stay in power. And I don't think that we should pass legislation that just simply, you know, supports incumbents or unfairly supports incumbents. And this guy looked at me and he said, but Seth, you're an incumbent now. I was like, oh, I'm not that cynical. Okay? So it's another way of saying this is hard, but it's absolutely a priority. And the reason it's so important is fundamentally what you said, which is that we can talk about all these different issues, about guns, about climate change. We haven't even hit education reform. We've talked a little bit about women's reproductive rights. We can talk about all these different issues. But fundamentally, the reason that we can't do the right thing on guns, even though this is something that's supported by the majority of Americans, by the vast majority of Americans, is because of the influence of the NRA and their money in Republican elections. Because what the Republicans are worried about is not that they'll get beaten by a Democrat. They're just worried about getting primaried by someone who's more conservative in their gerrymandered district, right? Yes, I know. Elbridge Gerry. But this is like such a great, only in Massachusetts would we have this debate, but since Elbridge Gerry's house still stands in my hometown, let me justify why I use gerrymandering. Because I think it makes me feel a little bit better that like it's not quite so just deeply associated with only our district. So let's keep it called gerrymandering, but let's get rid of it. It's really too bad too, because does anyone know the history of Elbridge Gerry? He was a vice president of the United States and had this extraordinary mission under John Adams as president, where he had to go to France and basically convince them to give us some loans and not go to war. I mean, the country probably would not exist without Elbridge Gerry. It's a good lesson in like, just don't do something like gerrymandering later in life, because that's the only way people will remember you.
We have time for one last question.
Okay.
Thank you. Shifting gears to a different topics altogether.
Sure.
More on the presidential side. I want to hear a little bit your thoughts on the economy. How would, in your mind, if you had the power to navigate the economy? Specifically, I'm personally very concerned from the rhetoric of Bernie and Warren on going left, which I think will cause us to lose the election again. Because that's one of my concerns, is that whatever is going to be happening in the Democratic Party will be positioned in such a way that, again, you know, the other side will continue to support Trump, and then we're going to miss the whole thing. So I want to hear your thoughts on the economy, minimum age, all of these good things, and if we have time, and you have time, a little bit on the healthcare. This is a tough topic, very difficult to overcome it, and again, I'm concerned from the, you know, Medicare for all, it sounds great, but who the hell can pay for it, and how do you pay for it, and it links to the first topic.
Okay, sure. So I want to be clear, I'm not here to talk about my presidential campaign, so I'm not going to sort of give a campaign speech. But these are issues that, you know, that we vote on and think about in Congress. Yes, and so I'm happy to answer it from that perspective and just share my views. And look, I'll start by saying that, I mean, just so you know, I wouldn't be in this presidential race if I didn't think that I could be the best nominee to take on Trump, because I do think he's going to be difficult to beat. And I have a lot of respect for Senator Warren. I mean, I work with her all the time. I have a lot of respect for the other candidates in this race. But I simply would get behind one of them if I thought that they had a better chance of beating Trump. I mean, that just, you have to understand, that's why I'm doing this. You know, I'm not doing it to get my name out there or spend less time with my daughter. I mean, you know, this is the best way I think I can serve the country. And it does get to kind of the heart of your question, which is that I do think actually Trump's going to be harder to beat than many Americans think. And I think that because I've spent time in other parts of the country where we have to win voters back, where we've got to get those Obama-Trump voters back and build a big coalition to win this election. I've spent a lot of time there because, as many of you know who are active in politics, I had a big mission. Sort of, we as a district had a big mission, which was to help take back the House in the last 2 years. And we had an enormous impact on that. Many people have said that this district, the 6th District of Massachusetts, did more than any other district in the country to help win House seats back. And that wasn't just me, that was all of you who were involved. That is huge. It was also hard. And we lost some really tough races too, like Amy McGrath down in Kentucky, who came really close, and I'm doing everything I can to encourage her to take on Mitch McConnell. Because he's one of the only Americans I know who can beat him. But if she does, she's going to need every one of you to write postcards, to save up for a plane ticket to go knock on doors in Kentucky. I mean, whatever we can do, right? There's a lot of work to be done on this. But that wasn't your question. I just want to explain the context here because I think you should all know that. Look, with regards to the economy, there are a lot of great ideas out there. And if we're going to be the majority party, we should have the majority of ideas. And so I think it's wonderful that people are putting out different ideas. But one of the differences in my approach is that I think Americans really do want to work. I don't think that we should have a jobs guarantee or a universal basic income, because when I go to communities where people are not making the wages that they should or the wages that they used to, where they're struggling because they have 2 or 3 jobs, maybe they don't meet the unemployment statistics because they're either addicted to opioids or not looking for a job, or they have 2 or 3 jobs to try to make ends meet. What I hear is not, I want a handout. What I hear is, I just want to make sure I can compete in this new economy. And so what I've been talking about is a skills guarantee, where if you want a better job, the government will help you learn how to get it. Because what's fundamentally happening with our economy is it's just changing faster than ever before. And it's leaving a lot of people behind. Half the jobs that will exist in 2040 don't exist today. So even if our education system were perfect right now, and how many people think our education system is perfect today? No, sadly not. I wish we could say that. We can't. But even if it were perfect, we'd still have to retrain half the workforce. I want to make sure that if people want to go to college, they have the opportunity to go to college and it's affordable. But I also want to make sure that if you don't want to go to college, you will be respected for going to vocational school. And we literally have lines outside the door of Essex Tech right now. It's like the most popular school in the district. You know, Emmy hasn't announced yet what she wants to do for a career. But if she wants to go to college, I'm going to be proud of her. If she wants to build the college or she wants to defend the college, I'm going to be proud of her too, and America should as well. Those are just 2, you didn't even ask about education, but those are just 2 examples of the kind of reforms that I think we need writ large that will help our economy, and I think it sort of shows some of the differences that I have with some of the other candidates. You mentioned healthcare as well. I'm the only candidate in this race who actually gets single-payer healthcare. My bottom line is everybody in America deserves healthcare, but I'm not sure the best way to do it is to force everybody onto Medicare. And we can have a good debate about this, but I'm with President Obama, which is that I want a public option that can compete with private healthcare plans. Now understand, that's not what was passed under Obamacare. Congress cut out the public option, so that wasn't a part of it. But it should be. And I think that competition is healthy. I think it's the same way that, I don't think anyone thinks that the Postal Service is worse because of FedEx and UPS, where they have to compete for business. I think it's made the Postal Service better. If you have competition for delivering packages, you ought to have competition for delivering healthcare. It's much more important. So that's my view on it. But you also bring up a practical reality, which is that even if we were to somehow get elected on that platform, which by the way is going to be very difficult in the general election, we're not going to be able to get it through Congress because we don't have a way to pay for it. So we have to have big aspirations. And by the way, under my plan, if the public option, whether it's Medicare for all, or I would hope a more modern version since that was designed in 1963 and doesn't do important things like negotiate prescription drug prices, if under my plan that option wins out and you look at your healthcare options and you say, well, I can get Harvard, I can get Aetna, whatever the different healthcare, Blue Cross Blue Shield, but the public option is better and it puts the other ones out of business, and so be it. But that's competition, and everybody gets better and lowers prices when you have it. It's one of the reasons why the healthcare market is much better in Massachusetts than it is in other parts of the country, because even though I'm not trying to tell you that everything's perfect, healthcare prices are still too high, but they're much worse in places where where people only have one option. We actually have more options in Massachusetts than almost any other place in the country. So we got a lot of work to do on both of these things, but now at least you have a little bit of an idea of where my views are. So Emmy says it's time to go, and so I'm going to head out. But I'm actually on my way to, this is kind of an exciting day for me. I'm officiating my first wedding. You can do that as a member of Congress, and it's a same-sex couple in Salem, where we live, not too far from our condo. And so I'm excited about that, but I do need to run out for that. Let me just conclude by kind of coming back to where we started, though, which is that this only works, this great American experiment in democracy, if people take a stake in their democracy. And, I'm here as your representative fundamentally because of my time in the Marines. I wasn't interested in politics before. I didn't understand how important it was until I saw firsthand the consequences of failed leadership in Washington. But for all the tragedy of the Iraq War, a war that I was an outspoken critic of, one of the most inspiring days of my life was the day of the Iraqi elections. Because for the first time ever, the Iraqi people were able to actually have a voice in their future. And if you remember, the deal was you went in and voted and you dipped your finger in ink, and that's how they made sure you didn't vote twice. Well, anyone who voted received threats. I mean, there were a lot of threats from the insurgency against people for participating. And so we expected all the Iraqis to go put their hands in their pockets and walk around like this. But instead, they came out of those polling stations and held their fingers up in the air to say, for the first time in my life, my voice was heard, my vote counted. We're supposed to be the example of that, and yet today in America, not every voice is heard. Not every vote counts. There are people that think that patriotism is hugging the flag rather than fighting every day to make sure the flag stands for something. What everybody needs to know is that this country needs you to serve. And whether it's doing my job or your job, you need to participate in our democracy to make it better. This is when we need you more than ever. This is when people like your kids and my daughter are counting on us to take a stake, not just in our future, but in theirs. So thank you so much for being a part of this. Thank you for spending part of your Saturday with me. Let's keep up the great work. Take care. Thanks for having me.